I was arranging 4 file folders in strict accordance with the military color code on the oak table of the courtroom. Everything was aligned, silent, and orderly, exactly the way I prepared my gear before a deployment. The chaos of my life had to be contained within these edges. Suddenly, that quiet concentration was torn apart by my father's booming voice. He pointed a thick, calloused finger at me, laughing as he turned to the crowd behind him. "Look at her. She's so broke she couldn't even hire a lawyer. That girl is just a useless pawn in a game she doesn't understand." My hand, holding a cheap ballpoint pen, froze in midair. My chest tightened as if I had just taken a direct hit to the solar plexus. The giggles from my younger brother and the murmurs from the expensive suits around them scraped against my eardrums like metal on metal. The heat rushed to my face, not from shame, but from a cold, sharp pain shooting down my spine. They thought I came here to beg for mercy? Mistake. I took a deep breath, suppressing the hurt child inside, and woke the soldier up. I, Sergeant Alice Williams, raised my head high and looked straight into the judge's eyes. In this battered old briefcase, there wasn't just paper. There was proof of a betrayal that had lasted 33 years. The question was no longer whether I could get the house back, but whether a lone soldier could dismantle the empire of lies built by her own father. The Montgomery County courtroom smelled like old furniture polish and the kind of expensive cologne that tries too hard to mask the scent of arrogance. On the right side, the plaintiff's table was packed tight. My father, Frank, sat there like a king holding court, flanked by my brother Clay and Jonathan Huxley, the most notorious civil litigator in the county. Huxley was wearing a suit that probably cost more than my first car, flashing a smile that reminded me of a shark sensing blood in the water. On the left side, the defendant's table was an island of isolation. There was just me. No paralegals, no family support, just the American flag patch on the sleeve of my Army service uniform acting as my only friend. Huxley leaned back, pitching his voice just loud enough for the back row to hear. "It is truly pitiful," Huxley drawled, checking his manicured fingernails. "She thinks military discipline works in civil court? Poor thing. She should go back to the barracks and fold blankets. This isn't a firing range, and this certainly isn't a place for people who follow orders rather than give them." A ripple of laughter moved through the room. They looked at me like I was a strange animal that had wandered out of a zoo and into their civilized society. I kept my eyes forward, fixing my gaze on the empty judge's bench, employing the 1,000-yard stare I'd perfected over 3 deployments. But the sharpest knife didn't come from the lawyer. It came from my father. Frank leaned over to whisper to Clay, but his whisper was a stage whisper designed to cut. "I told you," Frank grumbled, shaking his head. "I never should have let her enlist. A woman gets involved with guns and combat, and her head gets all messed up. She loses her softness. Now she comes back here trying to bite the hand that fed her." Clay giggled, a wet, immature sound. He pulled out his smartphone, snapping a quick picture of me sitting alone. I knew exactly where that was going. Snapchat or Instagram, probably with a caption making fun of my stiff posture. "Let her be, Dad," Clay said, smirking. "She's just jealous because you left everything to me. That's what happens with spinsters. They get bitter when they realize nobody wants them." My hand was resting on my thigh under the table. I squeezed it into a fist so tight that my fingernails dug into the palm, breaking the skin. I needed that physical sting to distract me from the hemorrhage in my heart. Spinster. Damaged goods. Is that what they called the daughter who had wired home $800 every single month for 7 years? Was that the name for the woman who ate instant noodles in a dusty tent so they could have steak on Sunday nights? "All rise," the bailiff bellowed. The Honorable Judge Miller walked in, his black robe swirling. We all stood. Huxley buttoned his jacket with a flourish, radiating the confidence of a man who had already cashed his victory check. He glanced down at my perfectly aligned files and smirked. "Your Honor," Huxley began before I could even clear my throat. "Before we proceed, I have a humanitarian offer for Ms. Williams. If she withdraws this frivolous motion today, my client is willing to provide her with $500 for gas money to return to Virginia. We don't want to waste the valuable time of this court." $500. That was the price tag they put on my honor. That was the value of my mother's Victorian home? I slowly stood up. I didn't slouch. I snapped to the position of attention, my back rigid, my chin parallel to the floor. My eyes were no longer hurt, they were cold steel. I do not need gas money, Mr. Huxley, I said, my voice steady and projecting clearly without shouting. I need justice. The room went dead silent for a second. The defiance in my tone seemed to suck the air out of the space. But then Frank shook his head, looking at the judge with a performance of disappointed fatherhood that deserved an Oscar. She is still so stubborn, Frank sighed loudly. From the time she was a little girl, she just never knew her place. That phrase hit me harder than a physical blow. Never knew her place. If you felt the sting of those words, if you believe Alice deserves better than this betrayal, please hit that like button right now to show her she isn't fighting alone. And drop a comment below with just one word: justice, if you want to see her take them down. It dragged me out of that sterile, cold courtroom. The smell of floor polish vanished, replaced by the smell of ozone and wet asphalt. The murmur of the crowd faded away. I closed my eyes for a split second, and the siren of a passing police cruiser wailing outside the courthouse window began to distort. The sound stretched and deepened, transforming into the howling wind whipping against a windshield on Interstate 70. I wasn't in the courtroom anymore. I was back in the cab of my truck 3 weeks ago, driving into the heart of the storm. The howling wind on the highway was real, but the memory that triggered it was even louder. It started exactly 3 weeks ago, at 2 in the morning, inside my small quarters at Fort Belvoir, Virginia. The room was pitch black, the kind of heavy darkness you only get on a military base. My phone started buzzing violently against the wooden nightstand, the vibration rattling a glass of water I had left there. It sounded like an angry hornet. I bolted upright, my heart hammering against my ribs, expecting a deployment order or a unit recall. I fumbled for the device, squinting against the harsh blue light. It was Aunt Denise. Alice. Her voice was a terrified whisper, so faint I had to press the phone hard against my ear. Alice, you need to come home. Right now. Aunt Denise, is everyone okay? Is it Dad? My mind immediately jumped to heart attacks or strokes. He put the sign up, Alice, she choked out, sounding like she was hiding in a closet. Your father. He put a for sale sign in the yard today. He signed the papers transferring the deed to Clay yesterday afternoon. They are going to sell it for cash next week. If you don't get here, your mother's house is gone. The sleep vanished instantly, replaced by a cold shock. Sell the house? He can't. That house belongs to the estate. Mom's will left it to both of us. They don't care about the will, honey, Denise sobbed. You have to stop them. I didn't even pack a bag. I threw on civilian clothes, grabbed my keys, and ran. The drive from Virginia to Ohio is roughly 10 hours if you don't stop. I drove it like I was escaping a war zone. I hit Interstate 70 west under a torrential downpour. The windshield wipers slapped back and forth, thwack hiss, matching the frantic rhythm of my own pulse. For 10 hours, I didn't listen to the radio. I only listened to the math in my head. $800. That was the number that kept flashing in my mind. Every single month, on the 1st, I set up an automatic transfer from my USAA account to my father's local bank. $800. The roof is leaking, Alice, Dad had said 3 years ago. Mom's furnace died. We're freezing, he had said last winter. I believed him. I believed in the duty of a daughter. While my friends in the unit went out for beers or bought new trucks, I sat in the chow hall eating free meals. On the road, when my stomach growled, I pulled into a gas station and bought a day-old dry bagel for $1 because I was saving everything else for them. I chewed on that stale bread as the mile markers flew by, tasting the dust, imagining my father and Clay sitting in a warm kitchen, safe and sound because of my sacrifice. I wasn't a daughter to them. I realized that somewhere around mile marker 100 in West Virginia, I was just a cash cow, a livestock animal they kept alive just to milk dry. I rolled into our small Ohio town just as the sun was trying to burn through the morning fog. The streets were empty. The mist clung to the ground, making the familiar neighborhood look like a graveyard. And then I saw it. The white Victorian house where my mother used to spend hours pruning her rose bushes. It looked like a skeleton now. The paint was peeling in long gray strips. The porch sagged. The rose bushes were dead, just thorny sticks protruding from the weeds. But the thing that made me slam on my brakes, screeching to a halt in the middle of the street, was the wooden stake driven into the center of the dead lawn. Sold. The letters were painted in a bright, cheerful red that looked like fresh blood against the gray morning. They hadn't just planned to sell it, they had already done it. They had sold my childhood, my mother's legacy, while I was hundreds of miles away serving my country. I didn't go to the front door. My training took over, assessed the perimeter before engaging the target. I killed the engine and stepped out. The air smelled of wet leaves and neglect. I moved silently around the side of the house toward the kitchen entrance. That was where the trash cans were kept. If you want to know the truth about a person, don't listen to what they say. Look at what they throw away. The lid of the main bin was loose. I lifted it. The smell of stale beer and rotting food wafted up, but I didn't flinch. I reached in, pushing aside a greasy pizza box. Clink. Glass. Lots of glass. I pulled out a bottle. Grey Goose vodka. Empty. I dug deeper. Maker's Mark bourbon. The expensive kind with the red wax seal. Another bottle, and another. There were hundreds of dollars of empty liquor bottles in this bin. Furnace repair, I whispered to myself, my voice trembling with rage. Then I saw it. Stuck to the side of a wet milk carton was a crumpled envelope. It had been ripped open and discarded carelessly. The return address logo was a stylized paddle wheel boat, the Riverboat Casino. I peeled it off and smoothed it out. It was a third notice of overdue payment addressed to Clay Williams. I scanned the numbers. The debt wasn't a few $100s. It was thousands. My knees felt weak. I crumpled the paper in my fist until my knuckles turned white. They didn't sell the house because they were struggling. They didn't take my $800 a month to fix the roof. They sold my mother's memory to pay for my brother's gambling addiction. And my father, the man who taught me to salute the flag and tell the truth, was the one driving the getaway car. I looked at the kitchen window. The light was on. I could see shadows moving inside. I put the crumpled letter in my pocket, took a deep breath, and marched toward the back door. The sad, grieving daughter had stayed in the truck. The soldier was going in. I didn't knock. I didn't announce myself. I simply shoved the back door open and stepped into the kitchen, bringing the cold, damp morning air in with me. The smell hit me first. It was the heavy, savory scent of meatloaf and mashed potatoes, leftovers from last night being warmed up for a late breakfast. It was the smell of my childhood, the smell of Sunday dinners after church, but today it curdled in my stomach. It smelled like a lie. My father, Frank, and my brother, Clay, were sitting at the round oak table, forks in hand, laughing at something on the small television in the corner. For a split second, they looked like a happy family. A family that hadn't just sold out their own flesh and blood. When Frank saw me standing in the doorway, dripping wet and shivering from adrenaline, the smile vanished from his face. He didn't stand up. He didn't rush over to hug the daughter he hadn't seen in 2 years. He didn't ask if I was okay after driving 10 hours through a storm. He just slowly lowered his fork, chewed the bite in his mouth, and swallowed. His eyebrows furrowed together in annoyance, as if I were a door-to-door salesman interrupting his meal. "What are you doing here, Alice?" Frank grumbled, wiping his mouth with a paper napkin. "You didn't call. I thought the army taught you basic manners by now. You don't just barge into people's houses." Clay didn't even look up. He was hunched over his plate, shoveling potatoes into his mouth with one hand while scrolling through his phone with the other. He let out a short, wet snort. "She probably ran out of money," Clay mumbled, his mouth full. "Came back to beg for a handout, I bet." My hand was shaking, not from cold, but from the sheer force of the rage vibrating through my veins. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the crumpled, wet envelope I'd retrieved from the trash can. I walked up to the table and slammed it down, right next to the bowl of gravy. The sound was sharp, like a gunshot in the small room. "Beg for a handout?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Is that what you think this is?" Frank glanced at the logo on the paper, the Riverboat Casino, and then looked back at me. His eyes were terrifyingly calm. There was no shame, no guilt, just a cold, hard defiance. "You sold Mom's house to pay his gambling debts?" I demanded. "You sold my inheritance, the only thing she left us, so he could throw it away at a blackjack table?" Frank sighed, leaning back in his chair. The wood creaked under his weight. "So what if I did? It's family business, Alice, something you clearly don't understand." "I don't understand." I felt like I was screaming, but my voice was barely a whisper. "I sent you $800 a month for 7 years. You said the roof was leaking. You said you needed heat." Frank waved his hand dismissively. "And I used it. I kept this family afloat. But Clay? Clay is in trouble. He's your brother. He's the son. He carries the Williams name. When he falls, I have to pick him up. That is what a father does." He pointed a fork at me. "And look at you. You have a steady paycheck from the government. You have a roof over your head in the barracks. You are independent. You don't need this house. Clay needs it. Don't be so selfish, Alice." The word hung in the air like toxic smoke. Selfish. I laughed, but it was a broken, jagged sound. Tears finally spilled over, hot and stinging on my cold cheeks. Selfish? I have eaten dirt for 7 years so you could live comfortably. I haven't bought new clothes. I haven't gone on vacation. I sent you everything I had. Frank stood up then. He slammed his palms onto the table, rattling the plates. He loomed over me, casting a long shadow, just like he did when I was a child. The air in the kitchen felt suddenly thin. "That money was your duty," he roared. "I raised you. I fed you. You paying me back is just balancing the ledger. But this house, this capital, this is for the one who needs a future. Clay is fragile, Alice. He needs a safety net. You are a tank. You are tough. Why did God give you that strength if not to carry the burden for your brother? Don't let me stand here and feel ashamed that I raised a daughter who counts pennies against her own flesh and blood." I looked at Clay. He was smirking behind his phone screen, safe in the shadow of our father. He knew he had won. He knew that no matter what he did, drink, gamble, lie, he would always be the chosen one simply because he was the son and simply because he was weak enough to let Frank control him. My father didn't sell the house because he was poor. He sold it because he loved Clay, and he didn't care about me. In his eyes, my strength wasn't a virtue. It was an excuse to neglect me. I took a step back. The warmth of the kitchen felt suffocating now. A verse from Sunday school floated into my mind, clear as a bell, drowning out Frank's heavy breathing. Psalm 27, verse 10. My grandmother used to whisper it to me when I cried in my room. "When my father and my mother forsake me, then the Lord will take me up." I wiped my face with the back of my hand. The tears stopped. The shaking stopped. The hurt child who wanted her daddy to love her died in that kitchen, right next to the meatloaf. In her place, Sergeant Williams stood tall. I looked Frank in the eye. For the first time in my life, I didn't see a giant. I saw a small, sad, prejudiced old man. "Fine," I said. My voice was dry, devoid of any emotion. "If you want to talk about duty and ledgers, Dad, then let's do that. But we aren't going to talk about it at the dinner table anymore." "Where are you going?" Frank demanded, sensing the shift in my tone. "I'm going to get a lawyer," I said, turning my back on them. "If you don't treat me like a daughter, Frank, I won't treat you like a father. I'll treat you like a defendant." I walked out the door, leaving the warmth, the food, and the family behind. I stepped back into the cold rain, but strangely, I didn't feel the chill anymore. I had a war to plan. I rented a room at the edge of town, in one of those roadside motels where the neon sign buzzes louder than the air conditioner and the curtains smell like 30 years of stale cigarette smoke. It was a dump, but it was secure. I didn't need comfort. I needed a perimeter. I swept the clutter off the wobbly particle board table in the corner. I moved the coffee maker, the plastic ice bucket, and the Bible to the nightstand. This wasn't a dining table anymore. This was my talk, my tactical operations center. I treated this legal battle exactly like an intelligence operation. I taped a large sheet of butcher paper to the wall. In the center, I drew a box. The house. Around it, I mapped out the enemy movements. I used the military color coding system I had drilled into my brain during basic training. Red marker for hostile threats, Clay's gambling debts, the timeline of his casino visits, the dates on the overdue notices. Blue marker for friendly assets, Mom's original purchase documents, her medical records proving her state of mind. And black marker for the unknown variables, the lies Frank had told me over the last 7 years. I stepped back, looking at the wall. The daughter who cried in the kitchen was gone. Standing in her place was Sergeant Williams, analyzing the battlefield. I couldn't afford a high-powered attorney like Huxley. My savings were drained from supporting my family. So, I had to become my own lawyer. For 3 nights, I didn't sleep. I survived on a diet of black coffee that tasted like battery acid and adrenaline. I sat at that table, buried under a mountain of legal books I'd checked out from the county public library. The language of civil law was dense and intentionally confusing, a thicket of words designed to keep outsiders out. But to me, it was just another code that needed breaking. At 2 a.m. on the second night, I hit a wall. I picked up my phone and dialed Ramirez. He was an old squad mate from my first deployment who had used his GI Bill to go to law school before dropping out to start a security firm. He answered on the 4th ring, his voice thick with sleep. "Williams, is everything okay? It's 0200. "I need a sit rep on inheritance law, Ramirez," I said, my eyes burning. "Specifically, the probate process." "Probate?" he groaned, rustling sheets. "Alice, if a property owner dies, the estate has to go through probate court to prove the will is valid and pay off creditors. You can't just hand the keys to someone else." "They skipped it," I said, staring at the timeline on my wall. Frank transferred the deed directly to Clay 3 years after Mom died, but there is no record of a probate hearing. "If they skipped probate," Ramirez said, his voice sharpening with interest, "then the chain of title is broken. The transfer is invalid, it's just a piece of paper with no legal weight. But you need proof, Alice. You need a silver bullet." I hung up and went back to the books. I dug deeper. I wasn't looking for a loophole, I was looking for a weapon. And then, just as the sun was beginning to bleed gray light through the thin curtains on the 4th morning, I found it. It was buried in the appendices of the State Civil Code, Statute 42B, Section 3. I read it out loud to the empty room, my voice raspy. "A holographic will, one entirely handwritten, dated, and signed by the testator, shall take precedence over any subsequent property transfers not adjudicated by a probate court." My heart slammed against my ribs. A holographic will. Frank thought Mom's last letter was just sentimental instructions. He thought it was a goodbye note. But I had kept it. I'd kept it tucked inside the zipper cover of my camouflage pocket Bible for 7 years. It was handwritten, it was dated, and it was signed. It wasn't a letter, it was a kill shot. But I needed one more thing to make sure the target didn't get up again. I needed to prove intent. I pulled out the photo I'd secretly taken of the deed of transfer when I was at the house, before Frank caught me. I put it on the table under the harsh yellow light of the desk lamp. Next to it, I placed a copy of my father's tax return from 2014, which I had in my old files. I didn't have a microscope, so I used the zoom function on my phone, magnifying the signatures until the ink bled into pixels. I focused on the F in Frank. My father was a man who worked with his hands. When he wrote, he pressed hard, and his letters always slanted to the right, leaning forward like he was walking into a wind. But the signature on the deed, it was shaky. The pressure was uneven, and most importantly, the loop of the F slanted 15 degrees to the left. I lowered the phone. A cold smile touched my lips. Frank didn't sign that deed. He might have agreed to it, he might have allowed it, but he didn't hold the pen. Clay did. My brother, in his desperation to cover his gambling losses, had forged our father's signature. And Frank, in his blind loyalty, had covered for him. That wasn't just a civil dispute anymore. That was a felony. I capped my red marker and drew a large X over Clay's name on the wall. The planning phase was over. It was time to execute the mission. The night before the hearing, a late spring snowstorm rolled into Ohio, the kind that locals call a poor man's fertilizer. It was heavy, wet, and unexpected, blanketing the motel parking lot in a slushy gray mess. Inside my cheap room, the heater rattled and wheezed, fighting a losing battle against the draft coming through the thin aluminum window frame. The wind howled outside, sounding like a crying child. And for the first time in days, the silence inside was louder than the noise outside. I sat on the edge of the mattress, my knees pulled up to my chest, surrounded by the debris of my war room. The legal papers, the color-coded maps, the evidence of forgery, it all lay scattered on the floor. In the daylight, fueled by caffeine and anger, I was Sergeant Williams, a tactical machine dismantling an enemy. But in the dark, with the adrenaline fading, I was just Alice. I picked up my phone. The screen was black. No notifications. No text messages wishing me luck. No missed calls from family members checking in. I imagined Frank and Clay at a steakhouse somewhere, probably laughing with that shark of a lawyer, Huxley, clinking glasses and celebrating their imminent victory. They had each other. They had a team. I looked at the empty room. I had a coffee maker and a dripping faucet. A cold, terrifying thought seeped into my bones, chilling me more than the snowstorm. What if I win? If I walk into that courtroom tomorrow and destroy them, I will get the house back. I will save the wood and the brick. But I will lose my father and my brother forever. There will be no coming back from this. I will be legally vindicated and utterly, permanently orphaned. The loneliness hit me like a physical wave, heavy and suffocating. I felt small. I felt like the little girl who used to wait on the porch for hours, hoping her dad would come home early and play catch, only to watch him walk right past her to find her brother. I reached for my wallet on the nightstand. My fingers trembled as I pulled out a small square photograph tucked behind my driver's license. It was old, the corners soft and white from years of being handled. It was Mom. She was standing in the kitchen of the Victorian house, wearing her yellow apron, holding a tray of steaming blueberry muffins. She was laughing at the camera, her eyes crinkled in pure joy. I closed my eyes and inhaled deeply. Suddenly, the smell of stale cigarette smoke and motel disinfectant vanished. In its place was the warm, sweet scent of vanilla and baked blueberries. I could almost hear the oven door creak open. I could feel the warmth of the kitchen. Alice, her voice echoed in my memory, clear and strong. You have a backbone made of steel, just like your grandfather. Don't let anyone break you, honey. Not the world, and certainly not your father. She knew. She always knew. She saw how Frank looked at Clay with pride and looked at me with indifference. She saw the inequality. And she tried to fill the gap with muffins, with warm hugs, with whispered encouragements. She didn't leave that letter in the Bible by accident. She knew a day would come when I would need to fight for myself because no one else would. A tear leaked out, hot and fast. Then another. I wasn't fighting for property. I wasn't fighting for an asset. I was fighting to protect that smile in the photograph. I was fighting to prove that she was right to believe in me. I set the photo down gently and reached for the other object on the nightstand, my pocket Bible. It was small, bound in a camouflage zipper cover. It had been with me through basic training, through the humid nights in the barracks, and across the ocean to the desert. The pages were worn thin, soft as fabric. It fell open naturally to a page I'd marked years ago with a red ink pen. Psalm 27, verse 10. I ran my finger over the underlined text, whispering the words into the empty room. When my father and my mother forsake me, then the Lord will take me up. I read it again. Then the Lord will take me up. The tightness in my chest began to loosen. The words didn't just offer comfort, they offered a new reality. Frank had forsaken me. He had chosen his addiction to his son over his duty to his daughter. That was a fact. But I wasn't alone. I had a father who was higher, juster, and more faithful than Frank Williams could ever be. I had a commander-in-chief who saw everything, who knew the truth of what was hidden in the dark. I wasn't an orphan. I was a soldier under a different command. I wiped my face with my palms, drying the tears. The moment of weakness was over. It had been necessary, a purging of the fear, but now it was done. I stood up and walked to the closet where I had hung my uniform. My Army service uniform, the dress blues, hung there, pristine and sharp. I ran my hand down the sleeve, feeling the texture of the fabric. I checked the ribbons on the chest, making sure they were perfectly aligned, 1/8 of an inch above the pocket. I checked the gold stripes. Tomorrow I wouldn't walk into that courtroom as Alice, the neglected daughter. I wouldn't wear a civilian suit that tried to blend in. I would wear this. This was my armor. It told a story of discipline, of sacrifice, and of an oath to defend the Constitution against all enemies. And tomorrow, the enemy was a liar sitting at the plaintiff's table. I turned off the flickering bedside lamp. The room plunged into darkness, but the fear didn't return. I lay down on the lumpy mattress, pulling the thin blanket up to my chin. Outside, the wind still howled, but inside, my breathing was slow and steady. I closed my eyes and visualized the courtroom. I visualized Huxley's face. I visualized the evidence. Tomorrow, the gun would go off. And I never missed my target. The air in the courtroom had become stagnant, heavy with the weight of Jonathan Huxley's performance. We were back in the present moment. The flashback of the last 3 weeks, fading like smoke, leaving me sitting alone at the defendant's table while Huxley paced the floor. He was in his element. He held the deed to the house in his hand, waving it back and forth like a captured flag of war. "Your Honor," Huxley boomed, his voice dripping with practiced sincerity. "Mr. Frank Williams is a devoted father. He is a pillar of this community. He was forced, I say, to sell his own home because of his declining health and the sheer callousness of his eldest daughter." He stopped pacing and pointed a manicured finger directly at my face. "She disappeared, Your Honor. She ran off to play soldier, leaving an elderly father and a struggling younger brother to deal with a crumbling Victorian estate. And now she returns, demanding rights she forfeited years ago. This isn't about justice, Judge Miller. This is about greed." I looked over at the plaintiff's table. Frank was playing his part perfectly. He sat hunched over, dabbing at dry eyes with a white handkerchief, looking for all the world like a heartbroken old man abused by an ungrateful child. Clay sat next to him, shaking his head in mock sorrow, though I could see the ghost of a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Judge Miller sighed, rubbing his temples. He looked tired. "Ms. Williams," he said, his tone flat, "it is your turn. Do you have a response, or should we wrap this up?" The room went quiet. They expected me to stutter. They expected me to cry or beg for the gas money Huxley had offered. I stood up. I didn't rush. I pushed my chair back slowly, the legs scraping against the floor. I buttoned my suit jacket with a sharp snap. I checked my tie. I wasn't Alice the victim anymore. I was Sergeant Williams, and I was on the firing line. "Your Honor," I said, my voice projecting clearly to the back of the room, "I did not go to Harvard Law School like Mr. Huxley. I was trained in intelligence. I was trained to look at a landscape and see what is actually there, not what the enemy wants me to see." I picked up the first file folder, the blue one. Mr. Huxley claims I was absent. He claims I was negligent. I opened the folder and pulled out a stack of documents stapled together. "These are my monthly bank statements from USAA, the Military Financial Service." I walked toward the bench, holding the papers up. "For 7 years, Your Honor, on the first of every month, a transfer of $800 was made from my account to Frank Williams. That is a total of $67,200. I turned to look at Frank. He stopped dabbing his eyes. The memo line on every single transfer reads, "For Mom's house repairs. $67,000 is enough to replace the roof, install a new furnace, and repaint the siding 3 times over. It is certainly enough to keep a house from crumbling, as Mr. Huxley suggests." Huxley stiffened. "Objection," he barked. "Financial contributions do not equal ownership." "I am establishing a pattern of deception," I countered calmly, cutting him off. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the second document, the red one. "If $67,000 was sent home, why is the house rotting?" I asked the room. Why are the rose bushes dead? I held up the crumpled paper I had fished out of the trash can, now smoothed out and preserved in a plastic sheet. This is a third notice of overdue payment from the Riverboat Casino. A gasp rippled through the gallery. The murmurs started, buzzing like angry bees. $40,000. I read the number aloud, letting it hang in the air. $40,000 of gambling debt under the name of Clay Williams. The dates of the biggest losses coincide perfectly with the dates I sent extra money home for emergency repairs. I turned my body fully toward Clay. His face had drained of color, turning a sickly shade of gray. The smirk was gone. "Tell me, brother," I said, my voice cold and hard. "Did the money for Mom's furnace go into a slot machine? Or did you lose it at the poker table?" "Objection!" Huxley slammed his hand on the table, rattling his water pitcher. "This is character assassination. My client's personal habits are irrelevant to the legality of the property transfer." "It is entirely relevant to motive, Mr. Huxley," I shot back. "But if you want to talk about legality, let's talk about the law." I dropped the casino notice on the table and picked up my final weapon, the black folder. If you are cheering for Alice right now as she exposes the truth, hit that like button to show your support, and leave a comment saying, "No mercy," if you think she should keep fighting until the end. "You claim Frank Williams transferred the house to Clay legally," I said, looking up at the judge. "But you missed something. Or perhaps you chose to ignore it." I opened the folder and began to read, my voice ringing out like a drill sergeant's command. State Statute 42B, Section 3. I quote, "A holographic will, one entirely handwritten, dated and signed by the testator, shall take precedence over any subsequent property transfers not adjudicated by a probate court." Huxley froze. He knew the statute. Every lawyer did. But they rarely saw it used. "My mother left a letter," I said, pulling the yellowed, fragile piece of paper from the Bible I had placed on the table. "It is handwritten. It is dated 3 days before she passed, and it clearly states her intent for the home to remain in the family trust for both children." I looked at Frank. He was gripping the arms of his chair so hard his knuckles were white. He looked like he was about to be sick. "Frank Williams never took this estate to probate court," I continued, staring down the expensive lawyer. "Therefore, under Statute 42B, any transfer he signed is null and void. He tried to give away something that wasn't his to give." Judge Miller, who had been leaning back in his chair with a look of boredom for the last hour, suddenly sat up. He leaned over the bench, his eyes locked on the yellow paper in my hand, bright with interest. "Mr. Huxley," the judge said, his voice dropping to a dangerous baritone, "is it true that this estate never went through probate?" Huxley opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked at Frank, then at the paper, then at me. The shark had lost its teeth, but I wasn't done. I knew they would claim the letter was fake. I knew they would claim the signature was forged. That was their only way out. "Of course," I said, smoothing the letter on the table. "Mr. Huxley will argue that this will is not authentic. He will say anyone could have written it." I looked toward the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom. "That is why," I said, a small confident smile touching my lips, "I have brought a witness who saw everything." The mention of a witness acted like a physical trigger on my father. Frank Williams, the man who had sat stoically through the first half of the hearing, playing the role of the frail, aggrieved victim, suddenly erupted. He forgot his cane. He forgot his act. He shot up from his chair, his face flushing a deep, dangerous crimson. "This is ridiculous," Frank bellowed, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "That paper is just sentimental hogwash. Your mother wrote that to say goodbye, not to give away my property. You are twisting her words, Alice. I am the head of that house, and I have the right to sell it to whoever I damn well please." Jonathan Huxley, seeing his client lose control, jumped in to salvage the situation, though he looked visibly rattled. "Your Honor, I must object. The authenticity of that handwritten note has not been verified by a forensic expert. Anyone could have scrawled those lines on a piece of old paper. This is an ambush by the defense." The courtroom descended into chaos. The gallery murmured loudly. Frank was still shouting, pointing a trembling finger at me. "Bang! Bang! Bang!" Judge Miller's gavel struck the sound block with the force of a gunshot. "Order!" the judge commanded, his eyes narrowing behind his spectacles. "Mr. Williams, you will sit down immediately, or I will have the bailiff remove you for contempt. This is a court of law, not your living room." Frank slowly sank back into his chair, breathing heavily, his chest heaving. He glared at me with pure venom. I didn't flinch. I stood perfectly still, my hand resting calmly on the yellowed letter. I knew they would deny it. Denial was the first line of defense for liars. That was why I hadn't come alone. "Ms. Williams," the judge said, turning his attention back to me. "You mentioned a witness?" "Yes, Your Honor," I said, my voice low but carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "To authenticate my mother's handwriting and to testify regarding the fraudulent nature of the deed transfer, I call Mrs. Martha Collins to the stand." A heavy silence fell over the plaintiff's table. Frank's mouth opened slightly. Clay stopped his nervous fidgeting. The heavy double doors at the back of the room swung open. My Aunt Denise walked in, gently supporting the arm of an elderly woman. It was Mrs. Collins. She had lived next door to us for 40 years. To Frank and Clay, she was just the nosy old bat, or that senile woman who spent too much time sitting on her front porch swing. They ignored her. They underestimated her. They forgot that in a small town, the neighborhood grandmothers are the original surveillance system. Today, Mrs. Collins wasn't wearing her housecoat. She was dressed in her absolute Sunday best: a floral dress, a matching hat, and white gloves. She clutched her personal Bible to her chest like a shield. As she walked down the aisle, I saw the blood drain from Frank's face. He knew. He knew that Mrs. Collins sat on her porch until midnight when her arthritis acted up. He knew her kitchen window faced ours. Mrs. Collins took the stand. She moved slowly, but her eyes were sharp. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. "Mrs. Collins," I began gently, "where were you on the night of April 3rd, 3 years ago? The date on the transfer deed." "I was in my kitchen, dear," she said, her voice wavering slightly with age but clear enough for the stenographer. "I was making tea. My hip was hurting something fierce, so I couldn't sleep." "And what did you see?" I asked. She adjusted her glasses and looked directly at Frank. It wasn't a look of anger. It was the disappointed look of a friend who had watched a good man lose his way. "The lights were on in the Williamses' kitchen," she testified. "The window was open because it was an unseasonably warm night. The houses are only 10 feet apart. I could hear everything." "What did you hear, Mrs. Collins?" "I heard Clay shouting," she said, turning her gaze to my brother. "He was crying about money. He said the casino people were going to break his legs. Then he shouted." She paused, taking a breath. He shouted, "Dad, you have to sign Mom's name. Alice is far away. She's stupid. She won't know the difference. Just backdate it to before she died, and it's legal." The courtroom went dead silent. You could hear the hum of the air conditioning. "And then what happened?" I pressed. "I saw Frank," she whispered. "I saw him crying. He kept saying, 'I can't, I can't.' But Clay kept pushing. And then I saw Frank pick up the pen. I saw him sign the papers while Clay guided his hand. Objection! Huxley stood up, but it was weak. He dropped his expensive fountain pen on the table. It rolled off the edge and hit the floor with a clatter. He didn't even bend down to pick it up. He knew. The game was over. "You are a liar!" The scream tore through the silence. Clay leaped to his feet, his face twisted into an ugly mask of panic. "You senile old witch! You don't know what you're talking about. You're making this up." "Mr. Williams," the judge roared, "one more word and you are going to jail." Clay shrank back, cowering under the judge's gaze. But it was Frank who drew my attention. He didn't shout. He didn't argue. He just slumped. His shoulders collapsed inward. The imposing, terrifying father figure who had dominated my life, the man who demanded absolute obedience and respect, dissolved right in front of me. He looked at Mrs. Collins, then he looked at the floor. He looked like a pile of old laundry. The armor of patriarchy he had worn for 30 years had been stripped away, revealing nothing but a cowardly man who had let his son destroy his morality. I looked at him, waiting for the rush of victory. I waited for the joy of revenge, but it didn't come. Instead, a vast hollow sadness washed over me. I hadn't just defeated an enemy. I had just watched my father die, not physically, but spiritually. The hero of my childhood was gone, replaced by this small, broken accomplice. I closed my folder. There was nothing left to say. The truth had filled the room, and it was suffocating. The judge was gone for exactly 15 minutes. In that quarter of an hour, the courtroom felt less like a hall of justice and more like a pressure cooker waiting to blow. Huxley was furiously texting on his phone, likely trying to figure out how to explain this disaster to his partners. Frank just stared at the table, his face a mask of gray ash. And Clay? Clay was bouncing his leg up and down so hard the entire table vibrated. When the heavy oak door opened and the bailiff announced, "All rise," the air in the room seemed to thin. Judge Miller walked to the bench. He didn't look at his notes. He took off his reading glasses, folded them deliberately, and looked past the polished, expensive suit of Jonathan Huxley. His eyes landed on me. "In 20 years of sitting on this bench," the judge said, his voice slow and resonant, "I have rarely seen a case file prepared with such meticulous logic and precision by a layperson. Ms. Williams, you are living proof that dignity and intellect are not found in an expensive suit or a prestigious degree. They are found in integrity." He put his glasses back on and raised his gavel. "The court finds in favor of the defendant, Alice Williams." Bang! The sound was sharp and final. "The court declares the transfer of the deed to be null and void due to the lack of probate adjudication and the existence of a valid holographic will." The judge continued, reading from the paper. "The estate of the late Mrs. Williams is to be divided equally between her 2 children." He paused, looking directly at Clay. "However, given the evidence of misappropriated funds, Mr. Clay Williams is ordered to pay full restitution to the estate in the amount of $67,200 before he can claim any share of the property. Court is adjourned." Bang! That second gavel strike wasn't just a sound. It was the firing squad for Clay's lifestyle. It was the end of his free ride. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then Clay exploded. He shot up from his chair so fast it tipped over backward, crashing loudly onto the floor. His face was a terrifying shade of purple, the veins in his neck bulging like cords. He couldn't process it. He couldn't understand a world where he, the golden son, had lost to the sister he had mocked just an hour ago. "This is a joke," Clay screamed, spit flying from his mouth. "You can't do this. That money is gone. She tricked you." "Mr. Williams, control yourself," the bailiff shouted, moving his hand to his belt. But Clay wasn't listening. He turned toward me, his eyes wide and manic. "You ruined my life," he shrieked. "You jealous, bitter witch. You think you're so smart? I'm going to kill you." He lunged. He vaulted over the low wooden railing that separated the tables, swinging a wild, clumsy fist aimed right at my face. I didn't panic. I didn't scream. My heartbeat actually slowed down. I didn't see my brother anymore. I saw a hostile combatant. I dropped my center of gravity, shifting my left foot back, my hands coming up automatically into a defensive CQC, close quarters combat stance. I calculated the trajectory. I would block his right hook with my forearm, step inside his guard, and a simple strike to the solar plexus would drop him instantly. I was ready to hurt him. But I never got the chance. A massive calloused hand shot out from the side, grabbing Clay by the wrist in midair. It jerked him back with such force that Clay nearly lost his footing. It was Frank. The courtroom gasped. My father had stepped between us. He stood there, a broad, unmovable wall of Midwest farmer strength, shielding me from his favorite son. "Stop it, Clay!" Frank roared. His voice cracked, not from weakness, but from a raw, jagged emotion I had never heard before. Clay stumbled back, staring at our father in total bewilderment. He looked like a puppy that had just been kicked by its master. "Dad, what are you doing? Let me go! She stole our house. She robbed us." Frank didn't let go of Clay's wrist. He squeezed tighter, shaking the younger man. Frank looked him dead in the eye, and for the first time, the blind adoration was gone. It was replaced by a deep, agonizing shame. "No, Clay," Frank said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper that carried across the silent room. She didn't steal anything. She is trying to save the only honor this family has left. We are the robbers, son. We are the thieves. Frank shoved Clay backward, forcing him down into the nearest chair. Sit down and shut your mouth. Then, slowly, terrified of what he might see, Frank turned to face me. He looked at my defensive stance, my raised fists. He looked at the ribbons on my chest and the combat action badge that gleamed under the fluorescent lights. He looked at me, not as the girl who left, but as the woman who had returned. His shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him. He looked old. He looked tired. But for the first time in 33 years, he looked at me with respect. Alice, he whispered. He took a hesitant step toward me, his hands open and empty. I was so blind. I slowly lowered my hands, coming out of the fighting stance, but I kept my guard up emotionally. I thought... Frank's voice broke, and he had to clear his throat. I thought because you were strong, you didn't need me. I thought you were made of stone. So I gave everything to him because he was weak. I punished you for your strength, Alice, and I am so sorry. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't try to hug me. He just stood there, acknowledging the wreckage he had caused. The bailiff was moving in, but the judge waved him off. I looked at Frank. The anger that had fueled me for days, the rage that had driven me to build a war room and hunt down evidence, suddenly evaporated. It left me feeling light, but also incredibly weary. I unclenched my fists. The war was over. I had won the house. I had won the money. But as I looked at my father standing between me and the violence, defending me for the first time in his life, I realized I had won something much more valuable. I had finally forced him to see me. I stayed behind in the courtroom for another 40 minutes. There were forms to sign, copies of the judgment to secure, and a brief, satisfying handshake with the court clerk who looked at me with a newfound respect. By the time I pushed open the heavy brass doors and stepped out onto the courthouse portico, the day had shifted. The harsh, white light of the afternoon had melted into the golden hour. The sun was dipping low, casting long, stretched shadows across the marble steps and bathing the town square in a color like warm honey. The parking lot was mostly empty. Jonathan Huxley's silver Mercedes was gone. And Clay, my brother, was gone too. He hadn't waited to check on our father. He hadn't waited to apologize. The moment the money tap was turned off, he had vanished like smoke in the wind, proving exactly who he was. But Frank was still there. He was standing alone, leaning his back against the stone balustrade. He held his worn felt hat in his hands, turning it round and round by the brim. Without the arrogance of the morning, without the lawyer whispering in his ear, and without the son he idolized standing by his side, he looked unrecognizable. He wasn't the terrifying giant of my childhood anymore. He was just a small, aging farmer in a suit that was 10 years out of style. He looked up when he heard the click of my dress shoes on the stone. I tightened my grip on my briefcase. My instinct was to walk past him, to keep my chin up and maintain the professional distance that had protected me all day. I wanted to get to my truck and drive away from the wreckage of this family. Alice, he said. His voice was hoarse, stripped of all its boom and bluster. I stopped 2 steps above him. I didn't look at his face. I looked at his scuffed leather shoes. I'm going home, Frank. It's been a long day. Your mother always said you were just like your grandfather, he said, ignoring my dismissal. He was talking to the ground. Hard-headed, independent, you never asked for help, not once. Even when you scraped your knee learning to ride a bike, you just got up and wiped the blood off. He took a shaky breath, his fingers digging into the felt of his hat. I was afraid of you, Alice. I turned my head sharply. Afraid of me? I was afraid because you didn't need me, he confessed, the words tumbling out like stones he had been carrying for decades. You taught yourself to read early, you got that scholarship, you enlisted without asking permission. You were a fortress. But Clay, he was soft, he was weak, he needed me to survive. I thought that protecting him was what made me a good father. I thought you were strong enough to handle the unfairness. I thought you could carry the weight that would crush him. My chest constricted. A different kind of pain than the anger I had felt earlier. It was the ache of the strong child, the one who gets punished for competence. So, because I could handle the pain, you decided I deserved it? I asked, my voice trembling slightly. You think because I wear this uniform, because I carry a rifle, that I don't bleed? Do you think I wired that money home every month because I was rich? I did it because I wanted you to see me, Dad. I wanted you to look at me the way you looked at him. Frank finally looked up. His eyes were red-rimmed and wet. A tear tracked through the deep lines on his weathered cheek. I know, he whispered. I see it now. I stood there today and watched Clay run away the second he lost. He left me standing there without a backward glance. And you? You stood there and fought. You stayed. He shook his head slowly, a gesture of profound regret. I spent my whole life polishing a piece of sandstone, thinking it was a gem, and I threw away the diamond because it was too hard to cut. The silence stretched between us, filled only by the distant sound of traffic and the rustle of the wind in the oak trees. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He knew he hadn't earned it. He was just laying the truth out on the cold stone steps, hoping it would be enough to stop me from walking away forever. He took a step toward me, then stopped, unsure. He extended a hand, not to hug me, but reaching out in the awkward, fumbling way of a man who had forgotten how to be gentle. His hand was large, rough, and scarred from years of manual labor. I don't expect you to forgive me today, he said quietly. I don't deserve it. But that house. The roof on the west side is in bad shape. Worse than you think. You can't fix it alone. He swallowed hard. I know a guy at the old lumber yard over in Union County. He owes me a favor. We can get the cedar planks for half price. If you want the help. I looked at his hand. It was an olive branch wrapped in sandpaper. This was how men like Frank Williams apologized. They didn't say, I love you or I'm sorry. They offered labor. They offered to fix what was broken with wood and nails because they couldn't fix what was broken in their hearts with words. I could have walked away. I could have returned to my unit, deployed again, and never looked back at this town or this man. But a soldier fights for peace, not for perpetual war. I shifted my briefcase to my left hand and reached out with my right. I grasped his hand. It was warm and callous, familiar in a way that made my throat tight. 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, I said, my voice steady. I'll make the coffee. Do not be late, Frank. The army does not tolerate tardiness. He squeezed my hand, a weak, grateful smile breaking through the misery on his face. 0800, he nodded. I'll be there. I let go and walked down the steps toward my truck. The sun had set, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't walking in the dark. 3 months later, spring finally broke the siege of the Midwest winter. The heavy gray clouds that had hung over Ohio like a wet wool blanket rolled back, revealing a sky of piercing, vibrant blue. The last of the dirty snow piles in the grocery store parking lots had melted away, feeding the thirsty earth, and the dormant world was waking up. I stood on the second rung of an aluminum extension ladder, stretching my arm high to reach the top corner of the window frame. My scraper made a rhythmic shh sound as I peeled away the last flakes of the old, dead gray paint. Beneath it, the wood was still solid, waiting for a fresh start. The house didn't look like a skeleton anymore. Over the last few weeks, we had transformed it. We had primed the siding and were slowly covering it in a warm, creamy buttercream color that caught the sunlight and held it. The rose bushes, once thought dead, had been pruned back hard, and now tiny knots of green were pushing through the thorns. Down below me, on the concrete walkway, my father was kneeling on a foam pad. He was mixing a batch of mortar in a 5-gallon bucket, the metal trowel scraping against the plastic. He was repointing the brickwork on the front steps, the same steps where he had confessed his sins to me 90 days ago. We worked in silence, but it wasn't the cold, suffocating silence of the past. It wasn't the silence of secrets kept or resentments brewing. It was the comfortable, companionable silence of a squad working toward a common objective. The only sounds were the scrape of my tool, the slap of his mortar, and the cheerful song of a red-breasted robin claiming its territory in the oak tree. It was the most peaceful sound I had ever heard. The ghost that used to haunt this house, the ghost of anxiety and debt, was gone. Clay was gone. 2 days after the verdict, he had packed his bags and skipped town, heading west to Nevada, presumably to find another game or another victim. We didn't talk about him much. His absence was like the removal of a tumor. The surgery had been painful, but the healing could finally begin. Frank had changed. It wasn't a sudden Hollywood transformation. He didn't become a poet overnight. He was still a gruff, quiet man who drank his coffee black and checked the weather report 3 times a day. But the hardness was gone. Every Tuesday night, he drove his truck to the community church for a counseling group for seniors. He never told me what they talked about, and I never asked, but I saw the results. I saw it in the way he stopped barking orders. I saw it in the way he learned to say thank you when I refilled his mug. He was no longer the dictator of the house. He was just a father trying to make up for lost time. "Take a break, Alice." Frank's voice drifted up from below. "Shoulders must be burning by now." I climbed down the ladder, wiping my hands on my paint-splattered jeans. I walked over to the small wooden table we had set up on the porch. This was the same wobbly table I had used as my tactical operations center in that motel room. Now it was painted a clean white, and instead of legal briefs and evidence of fraud, it held a thermos of coffee and a ceramic plate covered with a tea towel. Frank stood up, groaning slightly as his knees popped. He poured 2 mugs of steaming coffee, and then, with a shy, almost nervous gesture, he pulled the towel off the plate. I stared. Sitting there were 6 blueberry muffins. They weren't the perfect golden domes my mother used to make. These were lopsided. The tops were a little flat, and the edges were definitely burnt black. Frank scratched the back of his neck, looking anywhere but at me. "I found her old recipe card in the drawer," he mumbled, his face flushing slightly. "The oven runs a little hot. They might be a bit crunchy." I picked one up. It was heavy and dense. I took a bite. It tasted like scorched flour and overly sweet blueberries, but as I chewed, the flavor changed. It tasted like humility. It tasted like a peace offering baked at 350 degrees. "It's good, Dad," I said, and I meant it. "It's really good." The sweetness of the berry mixed with the salt of a tear that escaped my eye and ran down to my lip. I didn't wipe it away. We sat there for a long time as the afternoon wore on, watching the sun begin its slow descent behind the neighbor's roofline. The golden hour returned, bathing the fresh paint in a warm glow. Frank took a sip of his coffee and cleared his throat. He turned to look at me, his eyes clear and direct. "You're a good soldier, Alice," he said, his voice gravelly but soft. "You fought hard for this place. But more importantly, you're a good daughter. A damn good daughter. I'm proud of you." The air left my lungs. That was the medal I'd been fighting for my entire life. Not a ribbon for my uniform, but those 4 words from him. I looked up at the sky, past the freshly painted eaves of the porch. I thought about the little camouflage Bible tucked away in my room. Psalm 27, verse 10. "When my father and my mother forsake me, then the Lord will take me up." The verse had been my shield when I was alone. But looking at Frank now, broken but rebuilding, imperfect but trying, I realized that God hadn't just taken me up. He had done something harder. He had reached down and turned the heart of a father back to his child. I was Sergeant Alice Williams. I had served my country. I had dismantled enemies and navigated war zones. But as I sat there on the porch, eating a burnt muffin with my dad, I realized that the greatest victory of my life wasn't won in a courtroom or on a battlefield. It was won right here, in the quiet, restored peace of my mother's house. The house was saved. And finally, my heart was home. This battle taught me that true strength isn't just about endurance. It is about knowing your worth. For years, I confused duty with allowing myself to be used. I thought keeping the peace meant staying silent while my boundaries were crossed. Many of you, the caregivers and the providers, probably feel the same way. But I learned that you can love your family deeply and still demand the respect you deserve. Standing up for yourself isn't an act of selfishness. It is an act of dignity. And sometimes drawing a hard line in the sand is the only way to force the people you love to grow up and meet you there. Remember, a healthy family is built on truth, not just tradition. I know my story isn't unique. I know many of you are fighting your own battles right now. Maybe over a will, a house, or just fighting for a seat at your own dining table. If my journey gave you a little bit of hope or courage today, please hit that like button. It helps this message reach others who need to hear it. And I really want to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever had to practice tough love to save a relationship? Or are you currently struggling to forgive? Share your story below. Let's support each other. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so we can keep walking this road together. Over and out.